The thud of earth on a crate where a newborn daughter is buried alive, this was honor in 7th century Arabia. While empires bled dry, the desert drowned in greed. How did one merchant turn a few outcasts into a force that crushed Mecca? Why were 313 men more terrifying than 1,000 swords? Witness how one idea toppled the world's greatest empires and sparked the miraculous rise of Islam. The year 600 of the Common Era marked a pivotal moment in human history, as the two dominant superpowers of the age, the Byzantine and Persian empires, had spent 400 years relentlessly exhausting one another in a cycle of endless and bloody warfare. The world was split in two, consumed by the clashing ambitions of these aging giants, while between them, in the shadow of these staggering titans, lay the sun-scorched and forgotten wilderness of the Arabian Peninsula. No ruler in the opulent palaces of Constantinople or Ctesiphon could have ever imagined that from these very sands, a force would soon emerge with the power to permanently erase the ancient empires from the map and rewrite the destiny of all mankind. As emperors and kings fought for global supremacy, their subjects were crumbling under the weight of unbearable taxes and rigid social hierarchies where a person's worth was dictated solely by birth rather than character. A profound social void had opened, creating a desperate and silent demand for justice among people who were tired of tyranny and systematic oppression. In this historical vacuum, where the old world orders no longer provided answers for the soul, Islam arrived not merely as a new faith, but as a total liberation. It was a revolution that offered equality where there was once only disenfranchisement and light where the darkness of the age of ignorance had settled most heavily. In the heart of a desert that the powerful considered a void, an idea was born that would unite scattered tribes into a single, unbreakable monolith, destined to bring down the walls of the most impenetrable fortresses and open the doors of millions of hearts. In the middle of the 6th century, the city of Mecca had transformed into a dominant trade hub, serving as a vital artery of commerce that connected the luxury of the East to the markets of the West. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of wealth and the shadows of the 360 idols surrounding the Kaaba, lay a civilization in the throes of a deep and systemic crisis. The prosperity of the ruling elite was built upon a foundation of merciless usury, a practice known as riba, which was designed to keep the poor in a perpetual state of debt and economic bondage, effectively turning them into slaves for the sake of profit. In this harsh landscape, the most vulnerable members of society possessed no legal protection, and the chilling practice of burying infant daughters alive was a testament to the absolute moral decay that had taken root. Into this world of corruption and tribal arrogance, a man named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, moved with a quiet but profound dignity that commanded the respect of every merchant and shepherd alike. Long before he was called to his divine mission at the age of 40, he had already earned the unique titles of Al-Sadiq and Al-Amin, meaning the truthful and the trustworthy, because his integrity remained unshakable in an era defined by deceit. Whether he was leading a great trade caravan across the scorching deserts or negotiating a simple agreement in the marketplace, he proved that his word was more valuable than any amount of gold. People from across the Arabian Peninsula, even those who would later become his fiercest enemies, would entrust him with their life savings and their most precious secrets, knowing that he was the only soul who would never betray a covenant or exploit a neighbor. It was this impeccable foundation of character and his reputation for absolute justice in his business dealings that prepared the way for a message that would soon challenge the very heart of the Meccan establishment and offer a light of hope to the millions who were suffering under the old world order. The message brought by Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, was far more than a spiritual awakening. It was an intellectual earthquake that shattered the very foundations of tribal supremacy and social exploitation. The early Muslims were not merely victims of Meccan persecution, but the architects of a radical new reality, intellectual revolutionaries who dared to envision a society where a person's worth was weighed by their piety and character rather than their lineage or wealth. As the hostility of the ruling Quraysh reached a lethal peak in the year 622 of the Common Era, the movement transitioned from a struggle of ideas into a masterpiece of strategic execution known as the Hijra. This migration was not a desperate flight into the unknown, but a masterfully orchestrated operation designed to outmaneuver a monolithic power through precision and intelligence. While the assassins surrounded his house, the Prophet placed Ali, the son of Abu Talib, in his own bed to serve as a daring and selfless diversion, a move that bought precious hours while he and Abu Bakr quietly slipped into the night. They did not take the obvious northern road to Medina. Instead, they moved south to hide in the cave of Thor for 3 days of tactical silence, relying on a secret network of informants and a highly skilled non-Muslim guide who led them through treacherous, uncharted coastal paths that the Meccan scouts never thought to check. Upon their arrival in the city of Medina, the mission evolved from survival to statecraft through the creation of the Constitution of Medina. This groundbreaking document, often overlooked in the annals of history, was a stroke of political genius that unified the diverse inhabitants of the oasis. It formally established a multi-faith community, granting equal rights, protection, and religious freedom to Jews, pagans, and Muslims alike under a single sovereign system. By prioritizing the rule of law and mutual defense over ancient tribal bloodlines, the Prophet transformed a collection of refugees and rival clans into the world's first ideological state, laying the indestructible foundation for a civilization that would soon redefine the horizons of human history. In the year 624 of the Common Era, on the desolate plains of Badr, the burgeoning Muslim state faced its first existential threat. While the Quraysh of Mecca marched with a formidable force of 1,000 heavily armed warriors, they were met by a small, poorly equipped group of only 313 men who possessed only 2 horses and 70 camels. However, what the Muslims lacked in equipment, they made up for through a masterstroke of tactical resource warfare. Acting upon expert strategic advice, the Muslim forces seized the initiative by occupying the primary wells of Badr, securing the water supply for themselves and subsequently filling in or covering the remaining wells in the vicinity. This calculated maneuver forced the massive Meccan army to engage in a high-stakes battle while suffering the debilitating effects of extreme thirst under the scorching desert sun, essentially turning the environment into a silent ally. Beyond the control of resources, the battle was decided by a revolutionary shift in military science. Traditional Arabian combat of that era relied on individual feats of chaotic bravery and uncoordinated charges, but at Badr, the 313 were organized into a disciplined, cohesive unit. They stood in tight, overlapping rows, maintaining a wall of shields and spears that functioned with the precision of a phalanx. This rigid combat doctrine meant that the Meccan cavalry, despite their overwhelming numbers, could not find a single crack in the Muslim defense. The psychological impact was profound. The Quraysh saw not a group of refugees, but an immovable monolith that refused to break. As the disciplined Muslim ranks held their ground and eventually countered, the Meccan morale collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and the terrifying sight of an unbreakable enemy. This decisive victory at Badr served as a clear demonstration that superior tactical positioning and unyielding collective discipline could shatter the power of an army 3 times its size, forever changing the military landscape of the Arabian Peninsula. The year 625 of the Common Era brought a harsh and transformative trial for the people of Medina on the slopes of Mount Uhud. Seeking retribution for their humiliation at Badr, the Meccan leadership assembled a massive force of 3,000 warriors, including a formidable cavalry wing led by a brilliant and observant young commander named Khalid ibn al-Walid. To counter this numerical superiority, the Prophet implemented a sophisticated defensive strategy, stationing 50 elite archers on a critical hill with the explicit and unyielding command to hold their position at all costs, regardless of whether the army faced victory or defeat. As the battle commenced, the 700 Muslims fought with such ferocity that the 3,000 Meccans were forced into a chaotic retreat, leaving their camp and supplies abandoned. However, it was at this moment of apparent triumph that the greatest tragedy unfolded, not through the strength of the enemy, but through a catastrophic breakdown in the chain of command. Seeing the Meccan retreat, the majority of the archers believed the struggle was over and, driven by a desire to secure the abandoned spoils, they abandoned their post in a direct breach of their military subordination. Khalid ibn al-Walid, possessing the predatory instincts of a master tactician, immediately recognized this fatal gap in the defense and led his cavalry in a swift, encircling maneuver around the mountain, striking the Muslims from the rear. The field descended into absolute chaos as the Muslim ranks were caught between 2 fires, and a false rumor that the Prophet had been killed sent shockwaves of despair through the ranks. In the heart of this storm, the true spirit of sacrifice emerged. Hamza, the Lion of Allah, fought with legendary valor until he was martyred, while Ali, the son of Abu Talib, stood as an unbreakable shield, fending off wave after wave of assassins to protect the Prophet's life. The Battle of Uhud ended not as a total defeat, but as a painful and enduring lesson etched into the history of the faith. It served as a stark reminder to every future generation that victory is not a product of overwhelming numbers or initial success, but is entirely dependent on absolute loyalty to the chain of command and the unyielding discipline to follow every order to the very end. The year 627 of the Common Era witnessed the assembly of the most formidable coalition ever seen in the Arabian Peninsula, a force of 10,000 warriors known as the Confederates, determined to extinguish the light of Medina once and for all. Facing this insurmountable wave, the 3,000 defenders of the city found their salvation through a Persian companion named Salman al-Farisi, who served as a vital bridge between civilizations. Drawing upon the advanced military doctrines of the Sassanid Empire, Salman suggested a tactic entirely alien to the Arabian tradition of warfare: the excavation of a massive defensive trench around the vulnerable northern entrance of the city. This was a profound engineering breakthrough that fundamentally changed the nature of desert combat. For the Meccan warriors, who viewed war as a series of honorable individual duels and swift, uncoordinated charges. The trench was a psychological shock that rendered their massive cavalry useless. It turned the conflict into a war of attrition and a sophisticated siege, something the nomadic tribes were neither equipped nor patient enough to endure. However, the situation turned critical when the internal tribe of Banu Qurayza breached the constitution of Medina, threatening to strike the Muslim families from the rear. In this hour of extreme desperation, the conflict transitioned from a clash of iron to a masterfully executed battle of wits. A man named Nuaym ibn Masud, who had secretly embraced the faith, was authorized to conduct a high-stakes mission of diplomatic sabotage. By skillfully moving between the various factions of the coalition, Nuaym sowed seeds of deep suspicion and mutual distrust, convincing each group that their allies were planning to abandon them. This psychological warfare shattered the fragile unity of the 10,000 from within. Exhausted by the cold, running low on supplies, and gripped by a sudden, violent desert storm that tore through their camp, the Confederate alliance collapsed in total disarray. Their victory at the trench proved to the world that strategic innovation and the power of a unified intellect could triumph over the most overwhelming display of brute force. In the year 628 of the Common Era, the Prophet and 1,400 of his companions embarked on a journey to Mecca, not as conquerors, but as pilgrims seeking to perform the rites of Umrah. When they were blocked at a place called Hudaibiyah, a moment of profound diplomatic tension ensued that would offer the most critical lesson for leaders throughout history: the power of strategic restraint. The resulting Treaty of Hudaibiyah contained terms that appeared deeply humiliating to many of the companions. It dictated that any Meccan who fled to Medina must be returned, while any Muslim returning to Mecca would not be given back, and most painfully, the pilgrims were forced to turn away that year without entering the holy city. While senior companions like Umar ibn al-Khattab initially viewed the agreement as a surrender of dignity, the Prophet recognized it as a masterpiece of soft power and political foresight. By securing a 10-year truce and official recognition from the Meccan elite, the mission transitioned from a localized military struggle to a global ideological movement. This period of peace removed the constant threat of violence, allowing the message of faith to spread through dialogue, trade, and personal example rather than the sword. The results were staggering. In the 2 years following the treaty, the number of people who embraced the faith grew more than tenfold, exceeding the total number of followers gathered in the previous 18 years. Hudaibiyah remains the ultimate historical testament that a temporary tactical concession, when guided by a long-term vision, can be a more devastating weapon than any army. It demonstrated that true victory often wears the mask of defeat, and that the quiet expansion of influence during times of peace is the most sustainable foundation for the eventual triumph of a civilization. By the year 628 of the Common Era, the geopolitical landscape of Arabia was irrevocably shifting, and the mission of Medina began to prepare for its inevitable ascent onto the global stage. To secure the northern borders and neutralize the last major internal threat, the Prophet led a force of 1,600 men against the wealthy and heavily fortified oasis of Khaybar. This was more than a siege. It was an assault on a sophisticated network of stone fortresses that served as a financial and military center for the enemies of the state. When Ali, the son of Abu Talib, famously tore the massive gate of the castle from its hinges and led the final charge. It signaled to every surrounding power that the old world's defenses were no longer impenetrable. Having secured the peninsula, the prophet expanded his vision, sending envoys to the great monarchs of the world, including the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. When one such diplomat was executed by a Roman vassal, the conflict transitioned from a regional struggle to a monumental clash with a global superpower. In the year 629, a force of 3,000 Muslims marched toward the frontier to face a professional Byzantine army that allegedly numbered 100,000 men. This Battle of Mu'tah served as the first true test against European military doctrine and heavy Roman infantry. It was a collision of two vastly different worlds of warfare. The Muslim soldier, optimized for speed and desert mobility with light chainmail and supple leather shields, stood against the Byzantine legionnaire, encased in heavy iron plates and wielding long spears behind the massive, rectangular shields of the impenetrable tortoise formation. The battle was a brutal demonstration of unyielding courage as the three commanders, Zayd ibn Haritha, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha, all fell as martyrs while defending the standard. It was here that Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah, emerged as a master strategist by reorganizing the exhausted ranks and executing a brilliant tactical withdrawal that deceived the Roman generals into believing massive reinforcements had arrived. Although the Muslims retreated, Mu'tah sent a shockwave through the palaces of the Mediterranean, proving that a new and formidable power had arrived from the desert, ready to challenge the greatest empires in human history. In the year 630 of the Common Era, the long years of exile reached a momentous conclusion as the prophet returned to the city of his birth, leading a formidable force of 10,000 warriors. As they approached Mecca, the horizon was illuminated by thousands of campfires, a psychological display of power that signaled to the Meccan leadership that the era of resistance had ended. Yet, what followed was not a brutal sacking of a city, but the most remarkable display of humanism in the history of warfare. The prophet entered Mecca on his camel with his head bowed in humility rather than raised in arrogance, and instead of seeking vengeance for decades of persecution, he declared a general amnesty that stunned both friend and foe. He broke the ancient and vicious cycle of tribal blood feuds by personally forgiving his fiercest enemies, including Abu Sufyan, who had led armies against him, Washa, who had killed his beloved uncle Hamza, and Hind, who had mutilated Hamza's body on the field of battle. This act of radical mercy transformed the conquest from a military victory into a triumph of the heart, proving that the ultimate goal of the mission was the reformation of the soul rather than the acquisition of territory. After cleansing the Kaaba of its 360 idols, he returned the focus of the peninsula to the pure monotheism of Ibrahim, setting the stage for his final and most enduring legacy. In the year 632, during the Fawwal pilgrimage, the prophet stood upon Mount Arafat and delivered a sermon that would serve as a universal declaration of human rights for all of eternity. He shattered the foundations of racism and nationalism by declaring that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a white person over a black person, except through piety and good action. He revolutionized the social fabric of the age by commanding his followers to treat women with the utmost kindness and respect, granting them rights and protections that were unheard of in the ancient world. This sermon was the final piece of a divine blueprint, ensuring that the civilization he built would be anchored not in the strength of arms, but in the indestructible principles of justice, equality, and compassion for all of mankind. The passing of the Prophet in the year 632 of the Common Era marked the conclusion of an earthly journey, but it was merely the dawn of a global phenomenon that would forever alter the trajectory of human history. In just 23 years, one man had successfully transformed scattered, warring tribes into a unified and unstoppable civilization that, within 100 years, would stretch from the rugged Atlantic coasts of Spain to the distant frontiers of China. This rapid expansion was an event without parallel, yet the true marvel of this history lies not in the territory acquired, but in the profound shift of the human spirit. While historians often focus on the movement of armies, their primary weapon was never the sharpness of their swords, but the power of a liberating idea before which the walls of millions of hearts fell long before any city gate was breached. It was a vision of a world where the chains of economic bondage were broken, where racial superiority was abolished, and where the dignity of every soul was held sacred under a single, divine law. This legacy created a sanctuary of knowledge and justice that would serve as the light of the world for centuries to come. As we reflect on this monumental journey from the darkness of ignorance to the height of a global civilization, we invite you to consider the many trials and triumphs that defined this era. Which specific event from this extraordinary history struck you the most? We invite you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below as we continue to explore the forces that have shaped the world we live in today.